The wealthy groom laughed as he looked down at the dirty servant, completely unaware that he had just ruined his entire life with one single, arrogant slap. The music in the Lasmoria Palace ballroom was loud, but everything stopped the moment he struck the older woman who was quietly holding a standard catering bag. What this arrogant man didn't know was that this supposed maid was actually Duchess Margarita, the most powerful ruler of the neighboring empire and the mother of the wealthy princess he was desperate to marry. Comment where you're watching from right now, because this royal humiliation is about to get out of control. The heavy silence in the grand ballroom was thick enough to cut with a knife as the massive oak doors were suddenly thrown open and the Duchess's daughter, Lady Alistaria, stepped inside. She was a woman of immense grace, unmatched beauty, and absolute honor, wearing a stunning midnight blue royal gown that swept across the white marble floor as she walked. The moment her sharp eyes locked onto her mother, standing in the center of the room in a dirty maid's uniform, her heart dropped into her stomach. She didn't care about the hundreds of rich nobles watching her, nor did she care about maintaining her perfect high society posture. Alistaria walked past everyone with an intense, fast stride, bypassed the long banquet tables, and dropped to one knee directly before the servant, gently picking up her mother's mud-stained hand and kissing it with pure devotion and tears glistening in her eyes. The entire room stopped breathing, the laughter of the nobles choking in their throats as they witnessed the most powerful heiress in the realm bowing to a nobody. The wealthy groom, Lord Cassandra, stood frozen at the head of the table, his face completely draining of color as his mouth hung open in absolute, paralyzing terror. The woman he had just violently slapped wasn't a worthless intruder. She was his future mother-in-law, the absolute ruler of the entire neighboring empire. Panic surged through Cassandra's veins like ice water as he realized his entire golden future, his titles, and his dream of marrying into the throne were violently slipping away. Desperate to cover up his unforgivable crime before it destroyed him, he sneaked up behind the Duchess, his knees trembling so hard he could barely walk, his voice cracking with a fake, shaky sweetness. "Please, I beg of you, don't tell your daughter," he whispered frantically, his eyes darting around the silent crowd to see if anyone was recording his weakness. "I had no idea you were my future mother-in-law. It was just a terrible misunderstanding, a joke that went too far." The Duchess didn't argue, nor did she raise her voice to match his panic. She simply stood up straight, looked directly into Cassandra's desperate eyes, and offered him a chilling, knowing smile that promised complete devastation. She had seen the man's true, ugly nature under his expensive tuxedo, and there was absolutely no way this cruel, abusive snake was ever going to marry her daughter and touch their empire's wealth. But instead of causing a massive scene right there, the Duchess calmly reached in her apron pocket and tapped the screen of her encrypted phone. She didn't need to shout to destroy him, because she had secretly recorded every single second of his arrogant insults and the sharp crack of his slap on a live voicemail that was already playing directly through the giant palace sound system. The brutal recording blasted through the towering palace speakers, and every bit of Lord Cassandra's trashy behavior echoed with absolute clarity. The audio caught everything from the loud, insulting chuckles to the sharp, violent crack of his hand connecting with the Duchess's face. Hearing his own toxic words bouncing off the gold ceilings made Cassandra stagger back like he'd been punched, his face turning ghost white as he looked around the room, realizing he was completely cooked. Lady Alistaria stood up slowly from her mother's side, her jaw clenching so hard it looked ready to shatter as the reality of her fiancé's fake, abusive personality crashed down on her. Her eyes, which used to look at him with a bit of affection, turned into pure ice, locked onto his sweating, shaking frame. The stuck-up nobles who had been smirking just minutes ago were now completely paralyzed, staring at their expensive shoes, too terrified to even breathe in the presence of the furious princess. Cassandra literally lost all his composure, dropping to his knees right into the mud his own boots had brought into the palace, grabbing at the hem of the Duchess's oversized apron while weeping like a child. "It was a total mistake, I swear. Pre-wedding stress just made me snap. I completely lost my mind, he screamed, his voice cracking as he tried to scramble toward the main soundboard to rip the wires out and kill the playback. But the Duchess simply took a step back, letting the pathetic guy face-plant onto the cold marble without a single drop of pity in her eyes. The whole room watched the high-class, perfect gentleman act get violently stripped away from Lord Cassandra, leaving nothing but a desperate, exposed fraud shivering on the floor. Alistaria didn't say a word at first, but the way her hand gripped her royal dagger told everyone that this dude's punishment was going to be an absolute movie. The voicemail finished playing, leaving a dead, heavy silence in its wake that felt exactly like a death sentence for the broken groom. Cassandra looked up at his fiancée, his eyes begging for a second chance. But he knew deep down that no amount of fake tears could ever erase the audio proof that had just deleted his entire reputation in front of the kingdom. The heavy quiet in the grand ballroom shattered into a million pieces when Lady Alistaria turned her back on Cassandra, her voice slicing through the air like an absolute buzzkill. "You are completely stripped of your titles, your family wealth, and your place in this kingdom," she declared, her words sealing his fate as the guards dragged the screaming, broken guy out into the freezing storm. But as the heavy oak doors slammed shut behind him, the Duchess didn't start celebrating. Instead, she looked toward a quiet, dark corner of the room where a young boy was standing completely still. The Duchess's daughter's true groom, a young man named Isabel Land, had been forced into absolute obscurity because of his cruel aunt, Lady Verica, who had spent years treating him like a worthless slave after secretly orchestrating the tragic deaths of his parents. Verica had stolen Isabella's massive royal inheritance, hiding him away from high society while her own sons lived like spoiled princes. But tonight, that whole setup was getting liquidated. The Duchess had spent months tracking Isabella's real lineage, uncovering a wild web of forged deeds, stolen bank accounts, and dark family secrets that Verica thought she had buried forever. Alistaria walked over to Isabel Land, her heart aching for the guy who had suffered in silence for so long. And as she reached out to take his trembling hand, a sharp, piercing alarm began to blast from the palace courtyard. The grand windows rattled as the sound of heavy armored vehicles surrounded the estate, and the double doors were violently kicked open by a squad of royal investigators. Lady Verica, who was standing near the back of the crowd with a smug smile on her face, suddenly gasped for air as 3 red laser sights locked directly on her chest. The lead investigator stepped forward, holding a thick leather folder stamped with the royal seal of the neighboring kingdom of Drysa, a realm everyone believed had lost its royal bloodline 20 years ago. The investigator didn't look at the princess or the Duchess. Instead, he walked straight toward Isabel Land, dropped to one knee, and held up a shimmering golden crown. "The deception is over," the investigator's voice boomed, sending a wave of pure terror through Lady Verica's veins. "We have found the true, living king of Drysa, and his parents' killer is standing in this very room." Isabel Land froze as the entire ballroom turned to stare at him, his mind spinning as he realized the simple life he knew was history. But before he could even process the words, Lady Verica reached into her coat, her eyes wild with madness as she pulled out a hidden weapon and pointed it directly at Isabella's face, asking if anyone really thought he would leave this place alive. The weapon clicked in the deafening quiet of the ballroom, the cold steel reflecting the bright light of the chandeliers as Lady Verica's hand shook with pure panic. Her face was completely pale, sweat dripping down her forehead as she realized her 20 years of lies, forgery, and murder had just totally collapsed in front of the entire kingdom. "Stay back, every single one of you, or I swear I will end him right here," Verica screamed, her voice cracking with the frantic energy of a cornered animal as she tightened her grip on the weapon pointed straight at Isabella's face. The royal guards instantly drew their swords, the sharp ring of metal filling the room. But nobody dared to take a step forward because one wrong move meant the true king of Drysa would lose his life. Lady Alistaria stepped in front of Isabel Land, her body acting as a human shield, her eyes blazing with a dangerous fury that told Verica her time on this earth was running out. Isabella's heart hammered against his ribs, his breath catching in his throat as he looked at the woman who had stolen his childhood, the woman who had forced him to live like a slave while she spent his parents' blood money on her own spoiled family. But instead of crying or shrinking back in fear, a sudden wave of ancestral strength surged through Isabella's veins, his chin lifting as he stared directly down the barrel of the weapon with a cold, unyielding calm. "You think you can hide behind violence, eh?" Isabella said, his voice surprisingly steady, echoing through the silent ballroom with the absolute authority of a true sovereign. "You murder my mother and father, you forged their signatures, and you threw me into the dark, but you forgot one thing. Royal blood does not wash away in the mud." Before Verica could even process his words, the Duchess reached into her pocket and tapped her phone once more, sending a second voicemail directly through the palace sound system. It wasn't a recording of Cassandra this time. It was an old audio file recovered from Varric's private estate, a secret recording of her talking to her co-conspirators on the night of the fatal car crash 20 years ago. The speakers boomed with Verica's own younger voice, laughing as she described how she would swerve the car off the road and burn the evidence to claim the Drysa fortune for herself. Hearing her own historical confession blasting through the palace completely broke Verica's sanity. Her eyes rolled back in horror, her hand trembling so violently that the weapon slipped from her fingers and clattered loudly against the marble floor. In a split second, Alistaria lunged forward, kicking the weapon across the room and tackling Verica to the ground with a devastating blow that left the cruel ant coughing for air on the floor. The royal investigators slammed heavy iron chains onto Verica's wrists, dragging her up as her husband and sons were also surrounded by guards, their expensive jewelry being ripped from their necks as they were arrested for their complicity in a massive family crime. As Verica was dragged out of the room, crying and begging for her life, the lead investigator stepped back toward Isabel Land, the golden crown glowing under the light as the final countdown to his ascension began. But as Isabel Land looked down at the crown, a sudden, dark realization crossed his mind about the true state of his home kingdom, leaving everyone wondering if he would actually survive the dangerous journey back to Drysa. The heavy metal chains rattled against the floor as Lady Verica and her entire disgraced family were dragged out into the freezing storm, their desperate screams fading into the distant thunder. The ballroom was completely silent, the remaining high society guests still shaking from the raw intensity of the audio confession that had just blasted through the speakers. Isabel Land stood right in the center of the room, his eyes fixed on the empty space where his abuser had just been completely ruined, feeling a massive wave of profound relief and sudden, overwhelming responsibility pressing down on his shoulders. The lead investigator remained on one knee before him, his arms raised high, holding the glowing golden crown of Drysa that had been stolen from his bloodline 20 long years ago. Lady Alistaria stepped closer to his side, her presence warm and steady against the cold air of the room, her eyes filled with an undeniable mix of admiration and deep concern for the young man who had just conquered his past. The Duchess walked over, her servant disguise completely forgotten as she looked at Isabel Land with the fierce pride of a parent, her hand reaching out to gently touch his trembling shoulder. "The throne of Drysa has sat empty and bleeding for 2 decades, Your Majesty," the investigator whispered, his voice heavy with a dark gravity that shifted the energy of the entire crowd. "But you must understand, your return will not be some peaceful parade, because the corrupt lords who helped your aunt hide her crimes are currently occupying your palace, and they will destroy the entire kingdom before they give up their stolen power." The warning sent a sharp chill running down Isabella's spine, his mind racing as he realized that escaping his aunt's house wasn't the end of his fight. It was just the beginning of a full-scale royal war. He looked down at his hands, still showing the faint calluses of the hard labor he had been forced to do as a servant. And then he looked at the shining gold of the crown, realizing that his true destiny was going to demand every single drop of strength he possessed. Alistaria didn't hesitate for a single second. She stepped forward, drew her ceremonial royal sword, and pressed the blade against her chest, bowing deeply to Isabel Land in front of the entire assembly of shocked nobles. "I did not fall in love with a servant, and I do not bow tonight just because you are a king," Alistaria declared, her deep voice echoing with an ironclad vow that made Isabella's heart skip a beat. "I stand by you because your soul is pure, your courage is unmatched, and I swear on my life that my army will march into the fires of Drysa to place this crown on your head." The Duchess nodded in fierce agreement, her powerful political connections already moving behind her eyes as she began planning the massive military alliance that would back Isabella's claim against the corrupt regime. Isabel Land looked between Alistaria and the Duchess, the deep fear in his chest slowly dissolving into a hot, burning fire of absolute resolve as he realized he was no longer an orphan hiding in the dark. He reached out, his fingers closing around the cold, heavy gold of the crown, lifting it high enough for every noble in the room to see the definitive return of the lost bloodline. But as he prepared to make his final declaration to the court, a breathless royal messenger burst through the side doors of the ballroom, his face pale with horror as he held a blood-stained letter from the border of Drysa. The gasping messenger collapsed right at the entrance of the grand ballroom, his hand shaking violently as he held out that blood-stained letter, the dark red smudges on the paper instantly freezing the mood of every noble in the room. Lady Alistaria immediately rushed forward, snatching the warning from the messenger's weak grip, her eyes scanning the urgent lines as the muscle in her jaw clenched so tight it looked ready to snap. The entire space hung in a terrifying suspension, the quiet so absolute that the flickering sound of the candles felt like ticking bombs counting down to a catastrophic explosion. Alistaria looked up from the paper, her face completely pale, her eyes meeting Isabella's with a mixture of raw panic and devastating gravity that made his heart drop straight into his stomach. "The corrupt lords of Drysa found out you are alive, and they're completely losing their minds," Alistaria whispered, her voice trembling just enough to carry the terrifying news across the frozen crowd. "They have already mobilized their mercenary armies, crossing the northern border, and they are burning every single village to the ground to ensure you never set foot inside the capital city." A collective gasp echoed through the room of high society guests, several people clutching their expensive jewelry as the horrifying reality of a brutal, unyielding war crashed into their pristine, safe world. The investigator from Drysa slammed his fist against his chest armor, his face hardening with a desperate, ancient rage as he realized his homeland was being torn apart by the very monsters who had funded Lady Verica's original betrayal. Isabel Land felt a sudden, suffocating wave of dizziness hit him, the memory of his parents' burning vehicle flashing before his eyes as he realized that his mere survival was now causing the deaths of innocent people across the kingdom. He looked down at the heavy golden crown in his hands, the metal suddenly feeling like ice, a heavy anchor dragging him down into a violent destiny he never asked for while he was scrubbing floors in his aunt's house. But as he looked at the blood on the edges of the parchment, the fear in his chest didn't break him. Instead, it solidified into a terrifying, immovable wall of pure, unadulterated sovereign fury. He stepped away from the protection of the Duchess and Alistaria, walking right to the center of the grand stage, his worn servant boots clicking with a strange, hypnotic rhythm that commanded the absolute submission of every eye in the room. "They think they can burn my kingdom to erase my name, but they are completely mistaken," Isabel Land said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, low register that sent shivers straight down the spines of the richest men in the empire. "My parents died in the fire my aunt built, but I was born in those same flames, and I will not let the people of Drysa bleed for another second while those cowards sit on my throne." Alistaria watched him, her heart swelling with a fierce, burning adoration that completely consumed her soul, knowing that this man was the only one destined to rule her heart and his new empire. The Duchess immediately stepped forward, her sharp, analytical mind already calculating the logistics of the war, her voice booming with total authority as she ordered the palace guards to lock down every gate and prepare the royal horses for an immediate midnight departure. "We march tonight. No excuses," the Duchess declared, her eyes flashing with the cold light of a veteran strategist who had survived 100 political executions. "We will take our finest battalion, cut through the secret mountain pass, and hit their mercenary lines before they even realize the true king of Drysa is coming to claim his birthright." Alistaria drew her sword completely out of its scabbard, the polished silver blade catching the light of the chandeliers as she raised it high above her head, her voice echoing through the grand halls like thunder before a devastating storm. The royal investigators and the loyal guards in the room instantly copied her movement, a sea of shining steel rising into the air as the entire ballroom united behind the single purpose of total, unyielding vengeance. Isabel Land reached up, his hands perfectly steady now, and he placed the heavy golden crown firmly onto his own head, the jewels catching the light as he looked toward the heavy double doors of the palace. The final build-up was complete. The emotional pressure had reached its absolute breaking point, and as the grand horns of the palace began to blow the ancient war march, everyone in the room knew that the coming dawn would change the map of the world forever. The midnight sky above the kingdom of Drysa didn't just break. It exploded into a brilliant, golden dawn as the combined forces of Lady Alistaria and the Loyalist factions completely wrecked the final defenses of the corrupt lords. The war had been an absolute grind, a fast and terrifying campaign through the mountain passes. But the mercenary armies completely crumbled the exact moment they saw Isabel Land riding at the front of the battalion, his golden crown gleaming like an unquenchable fire under the smoky sky. The corrupt lords who had spent 2 decades bleeding the kingdom dry were dragged from the grand palace in heavy iron chains, their stolen wealth instantly confiscated and returned to the treasury to rebuild the villages they had burned. Isabel Land walked up the pristine marble steps of his ancestral home, his worn servant boots replaced by elegant royal footwear, though he still carried the same unyielding strength and humility in his eyes that he had learned during his years of captivity. The grand doors of the throne room were thrown wide open, and as Isabel Land stepped inside, thousands of citizens who had crowded into the capital city erupted into a deafening roar of pure joy, their voices echoing through the high arches like a beautifully orchestrated symphony of freedom. The Duchess Margarita stood near the magnificent royal dais, her eyes glistening with tears of intense pride as she watched the young man she had found in a cowering servant's apron prepare to take his rightful place as the sovereign of the realm. Lady Alistaria walked alongside Isabel Land, her armor dented from the fierce battles they had fought side by side, her hand never releasing his as they approached the legendary golden throne of Drysa. She stopped at the foot of the dais, slowly dropping to one knee before him, her eyes shining with a deep, consuming devotion that had only grown stronger through every life-threatening trial they had faced together. "The kingdom is finally at peace, my beautiful king," Alistaria whispered, her deep voice carrying through the sudden, emotional silence of the massive throne room. "But as I promised you on the night your aunt's lies were shattered, my heart belongs to you, and I want nothing more than to stand by your side, not just as your general, but as your wife, if you will have me." Isabella's breath caught in his throat, his eyes filling with tears of pure happiness as he looked down at the woman who had protected him, loved him, and fought for his justice when he was nothing more than an orphan maid hiding in the shadows. He reached down, his delicate fingers gently lifting her chin so she could see the absolute certainty burning in his soul, and he nodded his head with a soft, radiant smile that completely illuminated the grand chamber. "Yes, Alistaria, 1,000 times yes," Isabel Land whispered, his voice trembling with a joy he had never permitted himself to feel during his years of darkness. "You saved me from the dark. You gave me the courage to fight for my bloodline. And there is no empire in this world I would ever want to rule without you by my side." The entire throne room erupted into a deafening cheer, nobles and commoners alike weeping with joy as Isabel Land pulled Alistaria up into a fierce, protective embrace, their lips meeting in a breathtaking kiss that sealed the rebirth of a fractured kingdom. Months later, the capital city of Drisa was decorated with vibrant banners, golden flags, and millions of fresh white roses for the most magnificent royal wedding the world had ever witnessed, a historic celebration that united two powerful empires under a legacy of love and justice. The ultimate blessing came a year later, when the palace walls echoed with the sweet, high-pitched laughter of triplets, three beautiful, healthy children who would grow up knowing the true value of humility, compassion, and courage from their legendary parents. Isabel Land, the once-forgotten servant boy who had endured the ultimate humiliation, now sat proudly on his throne as a powerful, beloved king, proving to the entire world that true royal blood can never be erased by the mud.